What is it?
It's a chiapa.
I'm leaving this in.
No. It's a chiapa.
Okay, now stop. It's a chop. All right, 10th grade. Today we're diving into industrialization and imperialism and its effects on migration. This is our last content lesson, basically, until the interim or the AP test. Woo! And after this, we'll be doing a DBQ practice Thursday, Friday, and we will be doing our period reviews next week. So, with that in mind, big yawn from Melissa. Let's go and get started. So first, industrialization-based migration. So actually, before I get into this, we're looking at how industrialization and imperialism causes migrations. Because during period 5, specifically the 1800s, there's a huge increase in the amount of people who are migrating, which basically means the amount of people who are moving to somewhere else. So we want to split this up into how is industrialization causing this, how is imperialism causing this, who's affected, and the effects of this. So first, industrialization-based migration. So first, what are the causes or motivations of industrialization? How is it motivating people to move? Well, first, industrialization causes an increased population because there's more food, there's better medicine. As the population increases, that just means that there is less space in cities, there are potentially less jobs offered, there becomes more competition for labor, which encourages people to move. Not only that, capitalism as an economic system encourages businesses to try to keep wages low, and actively causes people to compete with each other. So that might cause also people to move. There's also a lack of agricultural-based jobs and old-style work with their hands jobs. These are jobs that are being lost through factories, and there are people who might still want to work these jobs, and so they want to leave and go somewhere where they can work these agricultural jobs. There's also just a lack of land. What often happens in countries where industrialization occurs, first in Europe and then other areas outside of Europe, as industrialization happens, land is bought and taken up by both the nobility and the upper class of the land is bought up by both the nobility and the urban elite, leaving very little land that the average person could own and survive off of. And so this might make them want to migrate so they can find their own piece of land and live as they normally done. And finally, travel is a lot cheaper thanks to steamships, railroads, just any sort of new travel technology is much easier and cheaper to travel across the oceans, like to completely different countries. So this motivates people to travel and leave the area they're in if they don't feel like where they live supports them. Cool. So what are areas of migration specifically for Europeans? We're going to look, where are Europeans moving during the 1800s? So first, there's a lot more internal migration. What I mean is that within countries and within the European continent, there is a lot of movement as people primarily move from rural areas to cities, or they move to countries that have more industrialization, more jobs. So you see a lot of internal migration. This is happening even today as people move to cities. And this happens more and more and more over time. Now, our bigger focus is external or international travel. Where are people migrating outside of the continent of Europe if they're European? So first, one major area that Europeans are moving to is Latin America. Remember, in the 1800s, Latin American countries have gained their freedom, but they're still ruled by that European descendant Creole upper class. And these areas are still primarily rural. As rural. They're still primarily rural, as their economies are based on growing cash crops and food and raising cattle and things like that. So for Europeans who still want to live that agricultural lifestyle, Latin America is perfect for that. Not only that, the Creoles give a lot of incentives and bonuses because they want more white Europeans to move to Latin America to kind of balance it out race-wise. So you see a lot of Germans, a lot of Italians, a lot of, who else? What's the other group? Yes, the Irish, actually, yes. So thank you. So we have a lot of Italians, we have a lot of Germans, we have a lot of Irish who move to Latin America and live there for generations, or in the end move back, but still we have a lot of them move there. Another area we see a lot of Europeans move is just settler colonies in general. So we talked about settler colonies the previous day, but in Africa, there's a lot of settler colonies. There's also in Asia, there's Australia and New Zealand. These are areas where Europeans can move to once again live that agricultural lifestyle. They get to have farms, large areas to themselves, so they can continue that that old style living. And specifically in settler colonies, empires want Europeans to move to these settler colonies to increase the European population. There's more people who are there to work. Not only that, if they move to these colonies, they get to kind of boss around they have to boss around the Africans or the Asians who live there, and they get to have this moral justification that they're help civilizing the local population. So you see a lot of Europeans move to settler colonies in Africa. And in Asia, they're specifically in Africa, it's specifically Zimbabwe, Kenya, South Africa, Algeria. In Asia, it's Australia and New Zealand. Cool. So our next area is imperialism-based migration. So in this case, we're talking a lot about Africans and Asians and why they're migrating. Because while in Asia, we have some states that are industrializing, like China and Japan and Ottoman Empire, overall, the reason why people are moving from these areas or migrating from Africa or for Asia is because of imperialism, because the effects of European strength. So first, what are the motivations? First, we have Africans and Asians, primarily Indians and Chinese, who are forced to move because of the effects of imperialism and industrialization. So for example, as European countries have influence, forcing these areas to industrialize and change, the people who live there might not like the new roles they play, they might not like the new jobs they have, and want to leave and go find better opportunities elsewhere. On the same time, though, a lot of these migrations are forced, or the European colonial power is forcing people to move, particularly to areas where they can make more money off them. A common thing that happens, such as in India and African colonies, is that European colonial rulers will force people to move to areas where they can help gather raw resources, which is of course going to make the colonial overlord more wealthy. Another example is how colonial empires will force people to move to other colonies where there is work. A classic example is how England would make Indians move to their colonies in the Americas, the Caribbean, where they're growing sugar. Sugar is always something you make a lot of money off of. You can't grow sugar in India, but you can Really?
I had to think.
That loud? Can you cover it up?
Oh, no.
But you could grow sugar in the Caribbean islands, so the English would force Indians to move to the Caribbean. Often as indentured servants. Indentured servants is basically where you have to work like a slave for 7 years and then you gain your freedom. Excuse me. Europeans also influence migrations. This is primarily the Chinese and the Japanese who we're talking about. What I mean influence is that where these migrants are going and why they're migrating in the first place is influenced by European change. So example, let's take China and Japan. Neither of them are actually controlled by European countries. China is economically controlled in a way. They kind of do what the Europeans say. The Japanese are influenced because they change because of the Europeans, but none of them are directly controlled like India per se. But because of the changes these countries are going through, Japan is rapidly industrializing. China is trying to industrialize, and they're making a lot of changes. This makes those people, Chinese and Japanese, want to move to find better opportunities. So for example, the Chinese and Japanese are going to move to European settler colonies like Australia as a way to work and gain money. For example, in Australia, they needed a lot of workers on plantations. Well, Chinese were willing to go there and work for very cheap. In America, there was a lot of labor to do in the western United States to build railroads. The Chinese and the Japanese were willing to go do that work. In Hawaii, for example, Hawaii has a significant Japanese population because the Japanese were willing to move to Hawaii to work there on sugar plantations. There's even a significant Chinese and Japanese migration to Latin America, as wherever there is labor, the Chinese and Japanese are willing to move there as a way to try to find a new life, a new prospects in the labor they know how to do on farms. Cool, so I kind of already said this in our areas of migration, but our main areas of migration for Africans and Asians is to European settler colonies as a way to work on plantations. Also just to work on European colonies on plantations, and anywhere there is needed lower level labor on farms or building infrastructure like railroads. So that happens a lot in Americas, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. Cool. Our last part is what are the responses to immigration? What happens when these immigrants show up? Overall, their treatment is very bad. A common theme we see throughout history is that when immigrants start to move to an area in large numbers, they are not treated well. There's a lot of reasons for this, but the primary reason is that the native population often views new people as suspicious. Immigrants or migrants often look different than the native population, so it's not easy for them to easily blend in or be a part of that population. There's this general fear of the changes that are going to come from these migrants. And the migrants are often scapegoated or blamed for any problems that happens because they look different. They are different. So it's a lot easier to say these different people are the reasons why things are going wrong. So there's usually this rise in fear. When there's an increase in migration, there's fear about losses of jobs, there's fear about increased crime, and there's just general racism, especially against immigrants who are different races than the native population. A common thing that occurs is that migrants are willing to work for much cheaper than the native population. This creates fear and anger amongst the lower class as they feel like their jobs are being taken by these new immigrants. There's also usually cultural and social fears as immigrants are of different faiths and of different beliefs. So there's this fear that those new beliefs are going to take over the culture. And another sort of treatment we see often is the passing of laws against certain immigrations. The two famous examples we have, both Australia and the United States passed specific laws against Chinese immigration to say that we don't want any more Chinese immigrants. They're hurting our country. And so there in the 1800s, we start seeing explicit laws against certain immigrants. Lastly, what often happens with immigration is the formation of ethnic enclaves. Alyssa.
It was an accident. It was a reaction.
I want to know what happened in a second. She's playing Animal Crossing. It's a really big deal. She's playing Animal Crossing.
No.
Serious.
I'm playing Sonic.
You're playing Sonic? So, ethnic enclaves. Ethnic enclaves are basically when migrants start to move to an area, they usually live together. This provides protection. This provides cultural understanding. It provides safety and security because you're living with people that you know. That's why in cities, you always have areas in cities where all the immigrants of a certain background live in the same spot. These ethnic enclaves often help preserve culture. They also are a place where you start seeing the changes. So like usually it's by the second or third generation where they start to blend in with the dominant culture of the area, but we always usually see where migrants move, ethnic enclaves form of their ethnicity. Cool, that is it. You're going to pause here. You need to do the following things. Make sure you do them. You need to go to the exit ticket. You need to pick the correct context. You need to complete the thesis. You need to SOD document 1 if you're an AP taker, also SOD document 2 and give me a cap, but put it in the Google form. If you do not put it in the Google form, it will not count. I'm not going to look at it. So make sure you put your answers in the Google form. Cool. If you have any questions, call me, text me, beat me if you want to see me.